All right, thank you all for joining us here this evening to discuss an important type of legislation aimed at curbing gun violence in the United States. My name is Jacob Charles, and I'm the Executive Director of the Duke Center for Firearms Law, housed here at the Duke Law School. The Center is excited to sponsor this event and similar programming throughout the year aimed at elevating the discourse around firearms law and the Second Amendment. As you may know, more than 40,000 Americans each year die by guns. Many more are injured. And of those 40,000 gun deaths, about 2/3 are suicides. We're very grateful to have with us a distinguished panel who is going to talk about one type of legislation that may be able to make a dent in these numbers. Before introducing these guests, I'll provide a short overview of extreme risk laws, or what are sometimes called red flag laws. These are laws that allow law enforcement to temporarily remove firearms from a person that a court has determined is dangerous to themselves or others. If the person asking the court to temporarily remove the firearms proves their case, the court will enter what's known as an Extreme Risk Protection Order, or ERPO, that permits law enforcement to disarm the person who has been found dangerous. 17 states in the District of Columbia currently have extreme risk laws on the books, and more than a dozen of these laws have been passed in the last 2 years alone. Clearly, in other words, there's momentum for this type of legislation. One important thing to note is that these are state-level interventions. There is no federal extreme risk law, and the proposals you may have seen in the news for federal legislation would not create one. Instead, the federal legislation would provide incentives for states to enact their own extreme risk laws that meet a certain minimum standard. The proposed federal legislation would also make it a federal crime for an individual who is subject to an ERPO, an Extreme Risk Protection Order, to purchase a gun in any state. So, for instance, someone who's subject to a North Carolina ERPO couldn't simply hop next door into Virginia and purchase a gun. But because the extreme risk laws are state-level interventions, they can vary a bit from state to state. There are several main features of extreme risk laws on which the states vary. First, states vary in who can petition for an extreme risk protection order. All states allow law enforcement to petition for one, and most allow family or household members to do so as well. Some expand the pool even farther to educators or administrative professionals at schools or coworkers that can petition for an ERPO. Second, the states differ in how a petitioner can get emergency relief. This often happens in what's called an ex parte proceeding, where the petitioner proves that an individual is at an imminent risk of harming themselves or others. The individual against whom the ERPO is sought, sometimes called the respondent, doesn't need to be present for these. That's why it's called an ex parte proceeding. The states vary in the showing that a petitioner has to make at this ex parte stage. The majority require something like good or reasonable or probable cause. Some require showing of preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not, and some require clear and convincing showing, which is generally the highest standard in civil cases. None require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is generally limited to criminal cases. Third, states differ in how long an emergency ex parte order can stay in effect. These range from permitting them to stay in effect for 1 to 2 days in Maryland, up to 21 days or more in California and Oregon. The most popular number among the states is 14 days for an emergency order. Finally, the states differ in what the petitioner must do to obtain a full ERPO, which usually lasts for between 6 months and a year. About 2/3 of the state require a clear and convincing showing, again, the highest standard known in civil cases, and about 1/3 of them require a showing of preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not. Extreme risk laws have been effective at generating bipartisan consensus in many states. But there are critics who say they run afoul of the Second Amendment or violate a respondent's due process rights. While we will not be focusing on the constitutional dimensions in the main presentation this evening, feel free to ask any questions about them in the Q&A afterwards. Briefly, so long as the procedural protections given to the respondent satisfy due process, any Second Amendment challenge to laws that temporarily disarm someone who's been determined to be dangerous face an uphill battle under current law. As for due process, the Supreme Court has said in general that due process requires notice of government action and an opportunity to contest that. The Supreme Court has also said that in exceptional circumstances, that opportunity to be heard can be postponed until after the deprivation. Thus, the idea of an ex parte, extreme risk order, is consistent with the Supreme Court's recognition that emergency situations justify quick action, necessitating seizure of property before a hearing is held. As I said, we'd be happy to discuss any of these issues in the Q&A. Thanks for bearing with that lengthy overview. Now it's time to turn it over to the panelists. The plan for tonight is that each of our panelists will discuss a matter for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A time at the end. We have the room until 7:30, but I know that I and I'm sure our panelists will be happy to discuss these issues anytime, even outside this setting. Let me introduce our panelists before we get started. First, we have Professor Kristin Goss. She's the Kevin D. Gorder Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. She also founded and directs the university's Semester in Washington program. Professor Goss's research focuses on civic engagement and interest groups in American politics. She is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 4 books: The Gun Debate, What Everyone Needs to Know, Disarmed, The Missing Movement for Gun Control in America, Gun Studies, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Politics, Policy, and Practice, and The Paradox of Gender Equality, How American Women's Groups Gained and Lost Their Public Voice. She is now at work on a book about elite philanthropy in an age of democratic distress. Before entering the academy, Professor Goss was a Washington-based journalist for 6 years covering nonprofit organizations and foundations for the Chronicle of Philanthropy. She received a BA degree with high honors from Harvard College, a master's degree in public policy from Duke University, and a PhD in political science from Harvard University. She's also a faculty affiliate of the Center for Firearms Law. Next, we have Professor Jeffrey Swanson. He's a professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Duke University School of Medicine, and a visiting scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research. Professor Swanson is a sociologist who collaborates across disciplines to build evidence for policies and laws to reduce firearm-related violence and suicide, and to improve outcomes for adults with serious mental illnesses in the community. He is an author of over 200 publications on subjects including the social, environmental context of violence and mental illness, implementation of state firearms restrictions related to mental health adjudications, effectiveness of involuntary outpatient commitment, and psychiatric advance directives. Professor Swanson led the research group that published the first empirical evaluation of risk-based temporary firearm removal laws in Indiana and Connecticut that were the precursor to the extreme risk laws that we'll talk about this evening. He received the 2011 Carl Tabb Award from the American Public Health Association and the 2010 Eugene C. Hargrove MD Award from the North Carolina Psychiatric Foundation, both for outstanding career contributions to mental health research. Professor Swanson served as a member of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Research Network on Mandated Community Treatment and the Methods Core of the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation Public Health Research Program. He frequently serves as a consultant to policymakers at the national and state levels, and he is also a faculty affiliate of the Center for Firearms Law. Finally, we have Representative Marcia Morey. She's a Democratic member of the North Carolina House of Representatives, representing District 30. She was appointed to the House on April 5th, 2017, and was elected to the seat in November 2018. Prior to serving in the North Carolina House, Representative Morey was a district court judge for the 14th Judicial District, Durham County, from 1999 to 2010, and was the chief district court judge from January 1st, 2011 until April 2017. Her professional experience also includes serving as the executive director of the Governor's Commission on Juvenile Crime and Justice to reform North Carolina's juvenile justice system, and as an assistant district attorney for the 14th Judicial District. Representative Morey earned her undergraduate degree from Millikan University in Illinois, her master's degree in education from Reed College, and her JD from Northwestern University Law School. A competitive swimmer since age 6, Representative Morey was co-captain of the U.S. Olympic team at the 1976 Montreal Games.
Wow.
All right, I'll turn it over to Professor Goss.
I have to follow that. Okay. So thanks so much for everyone for being here. I'm the designated political scientist, so what I'm going to try to do is put these laws in some sort of a historical and political context and talk about some of the policy challenges going forward, involving sort of government actors. And then my colleagues will sort of zero in on some of the more specific aspects of these laws. So for those of you who don't know much about the kind of the history of gun violence prevention in America, I think that it's been the case in the last decade or so. There's been what I call kind of a strategic turn toward more modest, more incremental, and more what we would call sort of narrowly tailored laws. So, back in the day when gun violence prevention started, there was a lot of talk of banning all handguns nationwide, or licensing all gun owners nationwide, by the federal government. And those kinds of bold proposals have really ceased being on the agenda, and gun violence prevention groups are looking to do things that are more modest and more aimed at people who may have some, presumed to have some sort of elevated risk of committing violence, of misusing their firearm. So, for example, there's been a lot of movement on the domestic violence front of sort of tightening up state-level domestic violence laws. There's been some effort to fix the reporting system for the background check, for the background check system, so that people who are prohibited from owning a gun, that their records get into the system where they can be stopped from buying one. And you hear a lot about also expanding background checks to private sales of firearms. So these are all kind of modest proposals that most likely would do quite a bit of good. So the sort of politically, ERPOs, I would say, are kind of a piece with those kinds of proposals. These more narrowly tailored laws are still the focus of a lot of political debate. So the National Rifle Association, which is the most powerful gun lobby and has, together with its state affiliates and other sorts of gun rights groups that exist at the state and national level, are still going to sort of fight a lot of these even more modest proposals. But in some cases, they will stand down and allow some of these proposals to be passed. So they're definitely less contentious than handgun bans and other sort of more bold or inclusive proposals. The ERPO laws are interesting because I think they offer something to people on different sides of the debate in some cases. So for gun violence prevention advocates who have faced a real political headwinds with respect to their agenda in at least a fair number of states, these ERPO laws can be sort of a flexible tool for a number of different kinds of situations. So, it's hoped that, they can be tools for preventing suicide, for preventing domestic violence, and even for preventing mass shootings. So they might, be applicable across a variety of potential scenarios. For some gun rights lawmakers, and emphasis on some, these laws also may allow the promise of doing something about gun violence, which is, rising up the political agenda pretty precipitously these days, without really directly affecting law-abiding gun owners who are not at, elevated risk of misusing their firearm. Now, that's not to say that these laws are drawing sort of, bipartisan support across the board. In fact, they're the topic of a lot of political conflict. My home state of Colorado, for example, half of the sheriffs have said that they have registered some sort of objection to that state's new ERPO law, including saying that they won't enforce it. So there's still, and their objections are both constitutional objections and objections on the sort of practical implementation side of things. Okay, so besides this kind of political and historical context, I think it's important to understand ERPOs in the context of evidence-based policymaking. So that's something that we at Duke care a lot about, and I think Professor Swanson is going to tell you even more about what that means and how you contribute to it. But ideally, you want a strong evidentiary base for your public policy. You don't want to just curtail people's liberty without having some reasonable expectation that it's going to produce some societal good, right? But gun regulations have been historically really hard to evaluate. So how do we know if a background check works to prevent gun violence, or pick your policy tool? And they're hard to evaluate for a bunch of reasons. It's hard to randomly assign people to be subject to the law and not be subject to the law and then measure the difference. Laws don't work that way, right? So it's hard to do these experiments that we would like. There are very few natural experiments where, states might, for example, similarly situated states might phase in their laws at different points in time, so you can, look at the difference in the impact. Those are very rare opportunities to do research. We also have the problem that states that have weak gun laws can undermine states that have strong gun laws. So this is where you hear, that Chicago has all this gun violence, and so that just proves that the Chicago gun ban didn't work. And then the rejoinder is, well, guns can flow in from Indiana, which has relatively weak laws. And then there's lots of things that go into whether, someone takes his or her own life, or does a mass shooting, or commits some other sort of gun violence. So there's lots of confounding factors that are hard to net out when you're trying to assess whether a law works. But thanks to Professor Swanson, primarily, and some of his colleagues, there was good research on a couple of the early ERPO laws, and Professor Swanson's going to talk about that. Equally important, I think, for the development, and as Mr. Charles mentioned, the rapid diffusion of these laws in recent years, is that there was a group of people who decided to make this happen. So in political science terms, we'd say we have a policy entrepreneur, somebody who thought these were really promising laws and was willing to organize around them. There was a funder who was willing to foot the expense for trying to sort of build out this area of law. And there was a research institution that could sort of help develop these ideas. So in 2013, a bunch of experts, sort of supported by these other actors, came together in what's called the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy, and Professor Swanson was a part of that and may talk about it. It was a project of an organization called the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, which is interesting because that is a national gun control group that started in the mid-'70s with a goal of banning handguns nationwide. So just the fact that this organization sort of turned toward evidence-based policy making and this kind of more moderate but, highly leveraged policy tool itself kind of illustrates what I was mentioning earlier about this kind of strategic turn. The goals of this consortium, and I'll let Professor Swanson tell you more about it, were really twofold: to bring evidence to bear in designing policy and to orient policy tools around demonstrated risk of committing violence instead of, just being in a category of people who have a certain type of diagnosis, right? So they were looking at, individual people and whether they are demonstrating an elevated risk of actually committing violence. So looking at the individual, not the group, right? So beyond that, I think the ERPOs represent a slight shift in strategy for gun violence prevention groups, and that is a strategy that's really trying to improve the implementation of gun laws. So those of you who take political science or public policy know that the legislatures pass laws, but then the executive branch, whether it's at the state or federal level, they have to implement those laws. They have to give those laws meaning on the ground. And we also know that laws can be implemented really unevenly. There might be a law in the books, but if nobody's following up, if the police aren't confiscating the weapons or courts aren't ordering them confiscated, the law can be kind of meaningless. And I looked at gun control for about 20 years, and I think it took me a long time to realize that the implementation is a pretty big gap in our system of laws, that they're pretty uneven, and implementation has not traditionally been a focus of gun violence prevention groups. They've been really focused on getting the laws passed, but then not so much on seeing that they're executed well. There's a big shift now with ERPOs. So in Illinois, the state gun control group there is literally going court to court across the state, trying to ensure simple things like do the judges have the right paperwork to be able to execute these orders. At the national level, the Ed Fund, the group that I mentioned earlier, is working on training law enforcement and social workers and mental health professionals, suicide prevention counselors, other kind of intermediary people who might be really helpful in getting the word out that these laws are available. And these national groups are also trying to highlight best practices. So Seattle has brought together local and county prosecutors and law enforcement around a joint statement in support of these laws. Prosecutors are trained, in how to sort of walk people through the process in court and follow up and make sure that the firearms, have been removed. Los Angeles is providing another model. So they're trying to sort of demonstrate best practices and basically get the word out that these tools are available. Mr. Charles mentioned the kind of rapid increase in these laws, and we're sort of in a situation where they're building the plane while flying it, that cliche. So you've got a bunch of new states that are coming online, and systems have to be put into place on the ground so that police actually know how to, what to do. They have to know these laws are available. Individuals where they can be petitioning need to know that this is a tool that's available to them. I will close by saying I think there are going to be sort of challenges to these laws having meaning, and the challenges are sort of along three fronts. So one I've sort of alluded to, which is awareness. So, law enforcement officers don't necessarily know about every new law that's passed by the legislature, or even how to implement it. So law enforcement and everyday individuals who might be living with somebody who's at risk and could be a good candidate for an ERPO. So public awareness is one challenge, and then systems and routines, just getting just that technical stuff on the ground of organizing, getting the forms in place, the protocols, the computer software to facilitate the implementation of these laws is a challenge. And finally, there's a political challenge. I mean, there is resistance. I mentioned Colorado, but this resistance among mainly rural sheriffs extends beyond that state to a number of others. So, the laws are only as effective as they are implemented well. And I think politics is still, like everything else, going to be a challenge. So I hope that's a helpful overview.
Great. So, thank you. Good evening. And thank you all for coming. I am going to talk about our research findings evaluating ERPO laws and why I think they matter. First, I'd like to acknowledge Professor Michelle Easter, who's in the audience here and is a co-investigator on the research that I'm going to describe and a co-author on the two papers in which we reported these results. I think that was a very helpful overview. As I think about the research and trying to address this problem and where it fits in, I think of gun violence prevention in our country as kind of a big jigsaw puzzle with a lot of pieces in it. And the puzzle we have in the United States is a little different than it might be in another country. Because other countries might look at this issue and look at this very lethal technology of firearms that can easily kill people and say, we're going to broadly limit legal access to guns because it's just too dangerous to have people walking around with guns. And we actually can't do that in our country. We can't say the default is people don't have the right to have a gun. Then we'll make a few exceptions out of the margins. Given the way that our United States Supreme Court has interpreted the Second Amendment to the Constitution, the default sort of is that people do have a right to have a firearm, and then we make exceptions kind of on the margins for who can't have a gun. That's a different way of doing it. And what it means is that since we can't broadly limit legal access to guns, we have to figure out who are the people who shouldn't have one. And one way of thinking about that is who are people who pose a risk of harming others or themselves with a firearm. And the sort of traditional way of doing that is to think about categories of people that we would say at the point of sale, you can't buy a gun. So people who have a felony criminal background, or people who, on the mental health side, have a history of involuntary commitment, or they've been found to be legally incompetent, or in a criminal matter, not guilty by reason of insanity or incompetent to stand trial. The problem with that is that those categories are about groups of people. They're not so much about individuals. And as they're implemented, it turns out that they're a little bit too broad and too narrow at the same time. Those categories tend to prohibit lots of people from purchasing a firearm who actually aren't dangerous and probably won't harm anybody. For example, somebody who might have been involuntarily committed to a hospital 25 years ago. And at the same time, in addition to being kind of too broad, they're too narrow. There are lots of people who actually do pose a risk of harming others or themselves, and they're not prohibited. They would pass a background check. They don't have any disqualifying record. And that's kind of where ERPOs come in, because in a country where we have a lot of firearms and the right to own them is constitutionally protected, and guns are embedded in our culture, not going away, we need to try to figure out who are the dangerous people, who pose such a high risk that it is justified to limit their constitutional right to have a gun, with due process in the way that Mr. Charles has described. So that's the little piece, in the puzzle. We've spent a lot of time in our country over the past several decades focusing on this point of sale, categorical restriction. But it turns out, if you think about gun violence and firearm-related injury and mortality as a public health problem, that it claims the lives of 40,000 people every single year. That's 100 people every day. So on the day that we have one of these horrifying mass casualty shootings. And we focus on that, and that really seeps into our national consciousness and our public conversation because it's so terrifying, it's so irrational, and we want to know what the answer is. On that same day, all around the country, 100 other people died as a result of a gunshot. We don't hear about them. We don't hear about them because those are people who die in, domestic violence incidents or gang shootings or, escalating arguments between two young men who have a firearm. And so if you think about it that way, almost 2/3 of the firearm-related injuries in our country are suicides, people who die at their own hand. And many, many of those people, one estimate from one of our studies, 72% of people who are gun suicide decedents could legally purchase a gun on the day they use one to end their life. A lot of people in that category, individuals like that, there's information that people have around them that they are in trouble, that they pose a risk. So to think about where these laws came from, within that perspective, the first two states, as you've heard, to enact a risk-based, time-limited, civil court-ordered law to remove guns, gives the police these clear legal authority to take guns away from people based on risk, were Connecticut in 1999 and Indiana in 2006. Both of them, as is the case with most of the other of these laws, were enacted as a legislative response to public outrage over a mass shooting. In 1998, there was a horrific shooting at the Connecticut State Lottery headquarters. People demanded something be done, and the legislature responded with this law. Interestingly, you often hear after a mass shooting these voices in the public square that say, it's about mental illness, it's not the guns, let's fix mental health. And with this particular law, the mental health stakeholders came to the table in discussing how this statute should be drafted and said, we don't want to make this about mental illness per se. I mean, there are tens of millions of people with mental illness out there in the country, and the overwhelming majority of them don't pose a risk to anybody. They're not violent towards others. Let's have this be about risk and behavioral indicators of risk. So probable cause that someone poses a risk of harming others or themselves, and two police officers agree on that, and they run it by a state's attorney, and then a judge issues this ex parte order in real time to secure those guns and make that person safe. And then 2 weeks later, according to the Connecticut statute, there's a hearing where the person has the opportunity to present their side of it, and then at that point, by clear and convincing evidence, the judge has to find the person poses a risk. So Connecticut passed that law, and not much happened for several years in terms, apropos of your comment about implementation. Just pass a law doesn't necessarily do anything. But after the shooting at Virginia Tech in 2007, the use of the law started to ramp up, every year. And so that quite a lot of cases, after the police figured out how to use this, people started to learn about it. It turned out, and I'll mention this in a minute, that even though it was passed as an attempt to do something about violence against other people, as it was used, about 2/3 of the cases, it was used where there's a suicide concern. This could be like a family member. We're really worried about granddad who has all these guns. He's all by himself. He's bereaved. He's depressed. He's drinking heavily. And he doesn't want to give up his guns. What do we do? If you live in 30 or some states around the country, there's nothing you can do. If granddad doesn't have a criminal record and he's not been found to be mentally incompetent and he's not accused of a crime, but in Connecticut, after this law was passed, there is something you could do. And you could reach out to law enforcement. They can look into it. They can investigate it, get this risk warrant, take granddad's guns away. And it turns out that with regard to suicide, if people try to end their own life, if they use anything else, they're very likely to survive. About 90% of people survive suicide attempts. But what I just said is true with one major exception, and that's if you use a gun, people almost never survive. They don't get that second chance. And so that is a really good public health opportunity. So in Connecticut, it turned out that was the major use of the law. Indiana a few years later. And it's interesting that those two states were the first two. I mean, they're very different states. One's kind of a red state, one's kind of a blue state, you know. And one state has much higher, you know, Connecticut has much lower household gun ownership rate and stricter gun laws and lower rate of gun fatalities than Indiana does. And the Democrats are in charge of both chambers of the state legislature in Connecticut, and in Indiana, the Republicans have a supermajority. Notwithstanding those differences, they focused on this problem in the same way and said, this is a tool that we need. Now, in Indiana, it was a little bit different. The case that precipitated this was a shooting of a very popular police officer by the name of Jake Laird. And what happened there was that the police had detained and transported a man with schizophrenia. He was in a mental health crisis, and they had taken his guns away. He had guns. But that incident did not result in a gun disqualifying involuntary commitment. This individual was held in a short-term involuntary hold. He was evaluated, he was treated, and then he was released, but he didn't actually get a court-ordered involuntary commitment, so he did not become a prohibited person. A few months pass, and he's in another crisis, and the police are called again, and this man to whom they had returned the guns opened fire and killed Officer Laird and another police officer, and injured another one. And the way this was presented to the public is, there's a loophole in this law that forced the Indianapolis police to give guns back to a man with schizophrenia. And that, you know, it sort of resonated with what people believe about people with mental illness, which is actually not true, but that's part of the impetus of the law. But in Indiana, just as in Connecticut, most of the time this law has been used where there's a concern about suicide. And just a few things about what we found in our evaluation. We looked at all of these cases over a period of years. And in Connecticut, we found, first of all, it was mostly men, but across the age spectrum, the number of firearms removed in each case, on average, 7 guns per person. So these are people who have a lot of guns. Another thing we found was that when we looked several years out into the future, matched the records of these individuals with death records, and we saw whether the person had deceased, and if so, was it a suicide, and if so, was a gun used, that the prevalence of suicide was incredibly high. It was actually 40 times higher than the general population rate of suicide in Connecticut. And it turned out that only a handful of those suicides that we found in these records were with firearms. And none of those happened during the year when the firearms had been retained by the police. They all happened after the person became eligible to get their guns back. It's very important, I think, that we found that this incredibly high rate of suicide in this population, because it shows that the law is not being just, you know, applied willy-nilly to everybody. It's being targeted to a very high-risk group of individuals who actually need some intervention. And I think that's important legally and probably politically as well. What we then did, and this is apropos of your comment, Professor Goss mentioned it's hard to study this, and what we were able to do, though, is to say, given that we know what the case fatality rate is for pretty much every method of suicide, we've got that information for the whole country and for Connecticut. We know if someone uses like a drug overdose, or they use a rope or something else to try to end their life, what's the chance they're going to survive? And so by looking at the methods of suicide, we were able to, just with a little, you know, algebra, figure out how many attempts there would have been to produce that distribution of suicide by those methods. And once we had that estimate, then we introduced a sort of a counterfactual, a sort of a what if. What if the guns had not been taken away? And that person who had 7 guns, instead of using another method that was much more survivable, had used a firearm. How many more people would have died? And the answer, you know, was a certain number of lives saved. And then you divide the total number of gun removal actions, and you ask yourself, how many gun removal actions do you have to save one life? And the answer is about 10 to 20. We got the same answer in Connecticut and Indiana. So that's kind of the answer, and that's the kind of information we want to put in the hands of lawmakers like Representative Morey and say, this is what's in the balance of risk and rights. And, it kind of invites the question, is that high or low? Well, it might depend on where you're standing. If you're someone who just cares more about the Second Amendment right than anything else, you might say that's unacceptable. But if you're someone like me and you have one or two or maybe 3 gun suicides in your own extended family, you might think about it differently. And I think that's the thing, is none of us is more than 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from a gun violence story, whether it's suicide or something else. And in that case, I think we can come to the conclusion that maybe this is an acceptable kind of approach. And it's one that people can actually do something about, and once we have these laws in place, if they're scaled up and everybody knows about them, then if you happen to be the neighbor of, say, Craig Stephen Hicks, if you recall that incident in Chapel Hill a few years ago, where this man was very angry and scary, and people knew that about him, and he legally owned a small arsenal of guns, and then he shot 3 young people in the head. It was an awful, awful incident. But if that was your neighbor, there would be something you could do. And we have anecdotal evidence now percolating up from some of the states that have enacted HRPOs that suggests that there have been a small number of cases where a person has been intending to carry out a mass shooting. And the HRPO process, or as it's been called in California, the Gun Violence Restraining Order, has identified that person and enabled that person to have their guns removed. And California, by the way, 2014 was the first of the whole new series of laws that really followed the model of the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy. And one of our recommendations, we developed this kind of model law, was to have family members be able to directly petition. And that was enacted in California. Again, the story there after the horrific shooting in Isla Vista, California, where this man named Elliot Rodger, his family had been concerned about him, and they actually had called the police and asked the police to do a welfare check on Mr. Rodger, but he didn't meet the criteria to be transported for a mental health evaluation or anything. They had to let him be. But if they had had a gun violence restraining order or an HRPO law in place, they could have actually give them the authority to search for and remove the guns, and that story that might have had a much less tragic ending. So, we have implementation challenges. As Professor Goss has mentioned, just passing a new law, and 17 states now have these new laws, doesn't mean that there's automatically going to be a big change. And I think what we need to do is to do a lot of research as we go forward, use each of these states as kind of a laboratory to ask the question, how is this going to work? What needs to be in place? What's the role of, say, prosecutors? What's the role of family members? Should clinicians have some role? And, how do we think about confidentiality? All these kinds of things. And we have this kind of conversation between evidence-based policy and policy-informed research. So we as researchers are actually doing research and asking questions that matter. We do a lot of things sometimes that are interesting to us that the answer doesn't matter. But we want to do research that really does matter. And that's, I think, what's exciting about being an applied social scientist and working in this interdisciplinary space and having the opportunity to have a conversation with lawmakers like Representative Morey. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Marcia Morey, and I'm going to bring it down from academics into just everyday what I've seen and why I got so involved in presenting this bill to the General Assembly 2 years in a row and let you know where it's gone. So I sat in the courtroom just about 2 miles from here in Durham and did criminal court and juvenile court and first appearances, and in fact did the first appearance of Craig Hicks the day after he killed the 3 UNC students, and it was chilling. No emotion, no expression, charged with 3 murders. And to see the community in grief over the loss of these 3 young people is just amazing. But that was only one case that happened frequently. Over my 18 years, just in Durham alone, on an average, 30 people die in homicide. That's over 580 cases. I probably did a lot of the first appearances. And sitting in a juvenile court as a judge, when the 14-year-old doesn't show up because he was killed the night before. And then I have a 15-year-old in court 2 days later because he's charged with murdering the 14-year-old. And then to have a hearing if he should be able to go home, and the mother takes a witness stand and says, I knew this was going to happen. I knew this was going to happen. He was enraged. Sure, he had a gun. I knew this was going to happen. I couldn't get any help. And hearing that in our court system time and time again, and multiply the 580 deaths times probably 8 for serious wounds from gunshots, for gang-related, for DVPO. I sat in domestic violence court, and I can't tell you the number of times we granted a domestic violence protective order, and if usually the woman would say, and he has access to a black gun, you know, well, do you know where it is? Yeah, well, I don't know where it is, but if that was evidence, we would say the sheriff, it can be surrendered. Well, our laws on domestic violence, you know, they'd go to the defendant and serve the domestic violence protective order, and you stay away. And by the way, if you have any guns, surrender them to the sheriff in 24 hours. It's like, well, I don't want to surrender them. So there's no teeth in the law at all. And then 3 months later to find out she had been killed by her husband with a gun. So it became very personal. It became very personal to see these families, to see what was happening. And I left being a judge on a Thursday back in May of 2017, and on a Monday, I'm sitting in the next back row of the General Assembly, a member of a minority. We had a supermajority Republican member of the minority with no power, no black robe, nothing except trying to speak truth to things we saw coming up. So go forward from sitting in that chamber until February 14th, 2018, when Parkland happened, on Valentine's Day, when 17 young people were killed in Parkland. And the grief, do y'all remember Parkland? And what happened after Parkland that was different than Sandy Hook or than Columbine, or what happened? It was the youth, it was the students that were enraged, that were outraged, that lawmakers, you must do something. And over at UNC, just a few days after Parkland, there were thousands out on the quad at UNC protesting, demanding we do something. That very next week, I introduced an ERPO for North Carolina. And it made the front page of the paper. New legislature, former judge introduces ERPO. We had a press conference responding to the demand of young people across this country. It is time to stop the violence and doing this. So we got a lot of press, and I also got, I can't tell you how many threats of death myself. The outrage of people, how dare you deprive me of my liberty, you take my gun, how dare you? I'll show you with enough lead in you to bury you under, you know, the General Assembly. I had to have Capitol Police watch me and the Durham Sheriff watch my house because of the outrage. How dare you introduce a common sense law to try to curb gun violence? Well, it only emboldened me. And we had presented the bill, and if you're not in the majority, you have no control of what bills get heard in committee and what doesn't. As you can imagine, my bill was never heard. So the next thing in the rule book we had is a discharge petition. All the Democrats signed a discharge petition to force it out of a committee onto the House floor. All I want is let's debate this. Let's put people on record. Let's talk about what's happening in our communities. Let's listen to the millions of young people in this country say, do something. ERPOs were really, I read about it in the National Journal. A conservative, you know, proposal, and that was it. Byline, a conservative proposal to stop mass shootings and excessive gun violence. It was their idea. It went nowhere. And so what do we do this year? Once again, introduce the ERPO. Same thing. And especially to help people of domestic violence to come in, say, order the removal of the gun temporarily. And the criticism is you can't take that gun without due process. Well, I contend as a judge, there is due process that's guaranteed in it. Someone has to come in and swear and sign a petition and give me facts as a judge. This is the kind of gun. This is the threat I've had. This is the behavior I've seen. And I, as a judge, could order a temporary removal until they get notice, not more than 10 days, come into court, everyone is heard. And really, the price someone pays to have their gun temporarily removed for up to 10 days, and they may get it back if, once again, the judge doesn't find, hearing every side, that this should be granted. Is that really a lack of due process? Anytime someone's arrested, they haven't been found guilty. You're presumed innocent, but we still arrest people and put them in jail, require them to set a bond. They have not been found guilty. Is that denial of due process? No, it isn't. So my assertion, these ERPOs very much follow the law. They follow due process, that community safety, people safety trumps the ability to own a gun. We get into the Second Amendment debate all the time. I think it's been misinterpreted, misread. I think it was applying to the militia, not to unlimited gun ownership. But we have had court cases, Heller versus DC, where they tried to ban handguns, and the court was very clear. There is a constitutional right to own a gun, but no constitutional right is limitless. You can regulate aspects of it because human life is more important than, I think, gun ownership rights. I'll show you what we did, and you will not be impressed in this day and age, but in the General Assembly, we have to use little poster boards. So the first time we entered the extreme risk protection, we said, why are we doing this? This was back right after Parkland. There were 100 mass shootings within the 5 months of Parkland. There were 22 in the first 5 months of 2018 of killings. And just that, at that time, 9 states had passed red flag laws. Well, then we came back. We reintroduced it the next year. So we updated every press conference. It's gone from 100 to 303. 4 months later, it was 370 to show how it's gone up. And to show also, we're now up to 16 states? 17 states.
And DC.
See, I'm old on this now. But every time we put this up, this is where North Carolina is not listening. We're doing nothing. More shootings, more killings. But coming from a courthouse, coming from watching hundreds of people affected by gun violence. I sat on a panel with Lori Edelhoff. Her daughter was the first one shot at Parkland. She talked about the horror of not knowing, the hours and hours of waiting to see if her daughter would be coming out. Her friends running out, where's my daughter, where's my daughter? And she would have survived until the shooter, the last time, the last shot, he went back and put the fatal bullet in her head. And to see someone who has been so intimately and irrevocably involved, who's now campaigning, going throughout the country talking about this is what happened to my daughter. Why can't common sense legislation be passed? So this is it. North Carolina has done nothing. We've again done discharge petitions. But after a month ago, do you remember El Paso and Cleveland? They kind of all run together, don't they? What's the latest one? El Paso and Cleveland. 5 Republicans came to my office finally because the president was giving some indication on background checks he might be amenable to. And also, for 24 hours, he said, I think we need red flag laws. And that gave them permission to come into my office and say, Marcia, let's look at your bill. We don't like that. We like the Indiana model because it's much more limited. But that was the first conversation in over a year that they started taking it seriously. And I guarantee you, in North Carolina, in the next days or weeks or months, when it's going to happen here, it's going to be too late for us to act. But I think that is what it's going to take for something to happen in North Carolina for us finally to do something that really can save lives. The conversations I had with the Republicans, it was kind of like what Jeff was saying, that, well, let's look at it through the mental illness. And I'm very much, we cannot tag mentally ill, equating that with violence. Otherwise, you know, why don't we let all the 9/11 hijackers off the hook, you know, as mentally ill? They weren't trying to, you know, bomb the Twin Towers. But we can't equate mental illness with this problem. So I'm glad you all are here. I hope the youth of this country, the college students, demand change, and it happens, because that is the movement we need. Otherwise, we will just keep going on until the final mass shooting will happen, when people start to act. And that day's coming. Thank you.
All right. So thank you to all of you. Really illuminating discussion so far. I've got one question to kick it off, and then I'll open it up if anyone out there has questions. I have many that I could ask if there aren't any questions from the audience. So first, to Representative Morey, one type of critique that you often hear about these laws is that they remove guns from the situation, but then they just leave the person alone. And it's a person that a court has found is dangerous to themselves or others, and all we're doing is going in and taking away the guns and then saying, all right, you go back and live in the community. Is that a problem from your perspective, and is that how you see these laws?
Well, I think that's one thing to take into consideration, and I'm also aware the suicide issue is bigger, really, than the homicide issue. I have had many people that say they have an elderly parent, grandparent with dementia, there are guns in the house, they have no idea how to get them out. So that with also, we do have the involuntary commitments. I mean, if it is someone that is in danger to themselves or other and with access to a gun, you do two parts. You remove the guns, people go, they might be committed. Most people that get committed involuntarily at Duke or somewhere else, they release them within 3 days. Or if not, they release them with medicine. You still want to make sure, if that's happening, that gun has been removed. So I think they complement each other.
Thank you. Yeah.
Just to add to that, from our research in Connecticut and Indiana, what we found is that in the majority of cases, when the police go out to serve the risk warrant, is called in Connecticut, they find a person in some kind of crisis. And most of the time, don't just leave that person there. They actually transport them. In 55% of the cases in Connecticut and over 60% of the cases in Indiana, transported that individual to a hospital emergency department for evaluation. And as a result of that, indirectly, in Connecticut anyway, when we matched the records to records of treatment in the public behavioral health system, we found that the percentage of those individuals who'd been respondents to a risk warrant gun removal, the percentage of them who were receiving some kind of mental health treatment, outpatient mental health treatment in the community, doubled from the year before to the year after. So it went from 12% to 24%. So my way of looking at that is that gun removal action became kind of a portal into getting some help. So that can happen. It's not written into the law. We already have, as you've implied, involuntary commitment and involuntary treatment law, an outpatient commitment. But it is the case that police, in their role of keeping people safe, don't just leave someone in a suicidal crisis, for example. At least we didn't find that empirically.
Great, thank you. So now I'll open it up if there are any questions for any of the panel members. Yeah.
My name is Alana Miller, I'm really involved with Everytown for gun safety. So I've kind of been seeing the gun violence prevention movement from like the grassroots side. And my question was for Professor Goss. I think your critique of the movement was right in that we do focus a lot on getting that law passed and not so much on implementation, especially in the states where it already is passed. So my question is, what strategies do you see as being effective to increase awareness or like just have better implementation in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think some of the strategies that are already being used are really, hopeful. So the bigger picture, before Moms Demand and Students Demand Action, and Everytown organized the gun violence prevention groups on the state and local level were pretty thin. They were pretty under-resourced. They were mostly volunteers. They were people who didn't have, they maybe had a lot of learned expertise, but, like a lot of volunteer groups, they didn't have a lot of capacity, right? And so, they could focus on getting the law passed, but, implementation is often very decentralized. It's police forces, it's sheriffs, it's courts, right? I think that the amount of kind of organizing and the number of new groups and the amount of resources that's going into the movement now is being dispersed across the states and localities. So there's just a lot more capacity to do this kind of, person-to-person kind of work. So, and I think the models are still being developed, right? So, as a political scientist, I think a lot about the role of elites and intermediaries. So, disseminating the word from the top down is probably going to be more effective. So find those key stakeholders who are at key positions in the system, and train them and allow them to sort of disseminate the messages, in a more decentralized way. Representative Morey might and Professor Swanson might have some better ideas. They're probably a little closer to the implementation side than I am. But.
Thanks for doing that. Students Demand Action, March for Our Lives. I mean, we have rallies all the time, and we go speak, and it is starting conversations. A lot of the youth have come over, and they'll wait outside and they'll talk to the leadership. And the more that come, the more they listen. I mean, some, have been filming, and one Republican legislature where the Students Demand Action went in, and they took their phone and started filming, and she said, "Oh, you young people, you don't even know what your pronouns are. How would you know anything about gun violence?" It was like so dismissive, but that this is an issue that people care about. This is an issue. You're going to take time. You're going to come. You're going to write. Hopefully we're going to get some hearings coming up. We're going to get this passed, but it also takes the groundswell of support of you all to help push it through.
Let me just add to that. I was part of something called an ERPO Summit at Johns Hopkins a couple months ago, and it was a gathering of people from all over the country representing most of the states in which an ERPO law has been passed, and there's some effort to implement it. And it was a whole day of sharing information. There were people from law enforcement, judges, and there were people who, from the mental health community and from the advocacy group community. And what I took away from it is that there is an important role for deliberate implementation action using what we know about how innovations get disseminated, from implementation science, whether it's in healthcare innovations or public policy innovations, and thinking about that, there isn't one solution for every state, for every jurisdiction. Some states have local solutions that they come up with that make sense for them. There is a role for all kinds of education, sort of formal education efforts where you have materials and webinars and podcasts that are focused on particular stakeholder groups like police. What's the role of law enforcement, and what do you do, and the courts and family members, so people not only know about it, but they know kind of what to do. And then there's actually a role too, I think, for recognizing that this takes some investment of resources, right? There needs to be some development of infrastructure. I mean, you know, if you go to a local municipal police department and they don't have very many officers and they have to devote some resources to implementing these things and they have other things to do, they may not be able to afford to do it. Then there's the question of where are we going to store these guns, you know, and things like the practical things. So the role, I think, of the federal legislation to incentivize states by providing grants from the Department of Justice to help states to do this, develop infrastructure, as well as to say, yeah, once you have this in place and you start using it and you have people who are you know, have their guns removed, let's make sure that we create a federal gun prohibitor in the National Instant Check System so they can't just go, you know, as we've said, to another state and get a gun. So those are things that are happening and, you know, that are organizational efforts. And the final thing that's really important, and it was so clear, you know, listening to these folks from around the country, is the role of a sort of local champion, someone who really believes in this and is influential and isn't just, you know, giving a speech about it and going away, but is actually there on the ground. And you have to incentivize people who are actually doing it, you know, not just the, you know, administrator who says, hey, this is a good idea, put this policy in place. But the, you know, local law enforcement actually see this as an important tool that's going to help them, you know, in their role in solving problems and keeping people safe. So it isn't just one thing, but it's just a whole kind of matrix of things that are important. And there is the twin challenge of once you have the law, how do you get it going to start with? That was Connecticut's problem. And the second one is once you do have it going, how do you sustain it over time? That was sort of Indiana's problem. And both of those things are important.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Anyone else have questions?
Hi, my name is Carly. I'm from Parkland, Florida, so a lot of these issues have a lot of personal meaning to me. My question, I know Representative Morey mentioned how a lot of these people you're encountering are 14, 15, 16-year-olds who are starting to manage to acquire a gun, use it, and that's where you start to see a lot of that violence. Do IRPA laws have any impact on those youth being able to get or receive a gun? Is there anyone on the panel?
Well, I'll jump in with one answer. So the question of youth access to guns is a little sideways from IRPA's because, you know, young people aren't supposed to have guns anyway. They aren't supposed to be able to go buy a gun. There's a minimum age standard for buying one. On the other hand, there are a lot of guns out there and they have access to guns sometimes in the home and are able to get guns otherwise, you know, in the secondary market or the illegal gun market sometimes. So two examples from our study in Connecticut, in two cases where a risk order was the petition for it and it was actually served and processed. The person of concern was a minor, was a young person. But they lived in a home where there were unsecured guns. And so the situation, and that's actually, you think about Sandy Hook, that was the situation, you know, with Adam Lanza, is that he was a person who was risky, but he lived in a home where there were guns. And so, and there were two judges actually that we interviewed, you know, anonymously as part of our, you know, key informant interview process, and they differed on the opinion about whether that was an appropriate use of it. One said, that's really not how you take an adult's gun rights away because someone else in the house is risky. If that's the issue, it should be a child welfare issue, not the use. But another judge disagreed, thought that's a perfectly good way to do this. If the adults in the house are responsible enough not to secure those guns and there's a teenager, then we, you know, can do that. So I think that's maybe an interesting question. It's a little bit unsettled. But the question of age, you know, as a risk factor and how you think about that whole transition is something we're studying, you know, in another project I can tell you about as well.
There's some early research coming out of California where they've been combing the records and looking at the circumstances in which the gun violence restraining orders have been used. And there are a number of examples where the juvenile is the person making, you know, demonstrating some sort of threat, and the GVROs are applying to the parents' firearms. So they're taking, you know, lawfully owned firearms out of the home for a year or so because the youth is posing a danger.
Same situation.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carly. Other questions?
Hey guys, so thank you so much for coming out. So I work with an organization called North Carolinians Against Gun Violence, and I also grew up in a small town in Kentucky called Hazard. There was a population of about maybe 1,000 people. My family owned guns. I continue to own guns. Everyone in my community owned guns. And what I can tell you from experience is that, you know, it's not that these issues that we're talking about are objectively true, right? That it's objectively true that having ERPOs reduces the likelihood of people who are at risk getting firearms. It's not, you know, we don't need to convince ourselves, right? And having grown up around these kind of people, and I know you guys are too nice to say this, but they're deluded. You know, you have people who are willing to say that Parkland and Sandy Hook were hoaxes. They're media hoaxes. And I know people who say this. They're not people who are randoms on the internet. And this is the narrative that they frame, you know? These guys are saying ERPOs will make sure that Adam Lanza and I can't remember the rest of their names, but all these mass shooters are never going to get guns. Well, hey, this was fake anyway. Like, look at this crazy stuff that they're trying to pull, right? It's a corner that you almost can't use logic to argue someone out of, right? Like, it's a really, really deep-seated delusion. And, you know, it's crazy that it's no longer the NRA that's the problem. Because the NRA almost agrees beat by beat with each of the things what we just talked about with ERPOs. They talk about how, you know, people should be punished if there's frivolous claims of ERPOs, or all the things that you guys are proposing that need to be part of ERPOs, they back. But it's gotten to the point that it's not the issue that there's these organizations like the NRA. There's a sort of consciousness around all these people that, you know, it's deny any evidence, and then once, you know, as tragically as Representative Morey said, you know, if this happens in North Carolina, sometimes that's not even enough, right? And that's terrible. Like, if that's not even going to work, like, there needs to be some sort of way that we address this issue of public opinion. So I just want to know, what are your thoughts on how the rhetoric about gun violence and any sort of gun laws, it's reached this really toxic place. So what are your thoughts on that? Anybody can answer.
You're right about the rhetoric. I mean, you know, my coming out with the ERPO, it's like, she wants to take away all your guns. No, I don't. I mean, yeah, I came from a family, you know, somewhere in NRA, and we had guns all over. It's like, no, has nothing to do with it. But you're absolutely right. The social media, and it feeds, they put my picture on Guns and Ammo, some, you know, national publication. It came out, and then it was like reimposed other places, and you know, it just, how do you control that narrative? You can't, you know, unless you stay informed and try and get the facts out.
Right.
So I would say this, you hear these sort of extreme reactions, you know, kind of the shrill voice that may not represent the large proportion of people who are in the middle and are not making their views known. And so if you look at what's happening in these, you know, echo chambers of extreme you know, gun rights rhetoric, I think, yes, that's of concern, but I also don't think we should generalize and think that represents everybody, because we have objective evidence from national polling data that show that large majorities of gun owners actually support sensible gun laws, including ERPOs, and actually don't see it as an expansion of gun control. They don't see it as something that affects a law-abiding gun owner who's using it for a legitimate purpose. They see it as, you know, even if they believe, well, guns don't kill people, people kill people, here's a law, a tool that helps you identify who those people are. And, you know, if you were to just ask someone, do you think that someone who's manifestly at high risk of harming himself or herself or someone else should have legal access to a gun at that time? Not forever. You know, people are going to say, no, they shouldn't have access to a gun at that time. People across the spectrum, even people who would disagree with each other on gun control, capital G, capital C, on the politics of that, agree with this. And that, I think, provides a kind of a common swath of real estate where we can stand there and say, okay, let's start here. And maybe that will help to bridge the gap between people who say, it's broadly limit guns, take away guns, and people who say it's not about the guns, it's about the people. And so I'm actually hopeful, and I sort of have to be because I'm in this for the long haul, and hopefully our research will outlast some of your recalcitrant colleagues.
So as your designated political scientist, I want to echo what my colleague, interdisciplinary colleague Jeff Swanson said. So there were a lot of things packed into that question.
Sorry about
And no, but I'm going to have like a few different answers. So one, I would completely echo what you're saying. There's a famous article by a historian named Richard Hofstadter called "The Paranoid Style in American Politics" that just traces these kinds of extreme voices throughout history. So this is nothing. It has a new manifestation in the kind of Sandy Hook hoaxing, but that's happened throughout American history, and we've still managed to legislate, right? That said, I think the gun issue has, like a lot of issues, has become much better sorted along partisan lines, and it's reinforced by social identities. So there's work that is not my work, but other political scientists who are showing that our social identities are becoming more correlated with one another, and they're being grafted onto the sort of partisan division. So there's, the people who drive Priuses and live on the coast and vote for Democrats and want gun control over here, and then there's the people you describe in Kentucky, and they're over here, and there's nobody bridging that gap, and they're just like two teams that are at odds with one another. It makes policy making around especially salient issues really, really difficult because I actually think a lot of the gun debate is not a debate about policy. Mm-hmm. It's something that's it's more of a team sport, and it's a team sport that like gets at people's personal identities, right? So that makes policy making really hard. That said, one answer to the loud voices on the, anti-ERPO side is to have loud voices on the pro-ERPO side. There's traditionally been, this is my first book was about this real organizational imbalance between the pro-gun side and the pro-gun violence prevention side. That's equaling out. And there's research by political scientists that shows that lawmakers, in this case they were talking about state lawmakers, are systematically overestimating the conservatism, including on guns, of their districts, of their constituencies. So they look at, what they ask the lawmakers, do you think, what percentage of your constituents do you think would be in favor of background checks? And the lawmaker will say, 30%. And then they actually look at the district and poll, and it'll be like 70%. And so their answer and there are two studies operating independently have found the same thing. And their conclusion is that basically the fact that pro-gun rights people are very loud, and they're very present, and they're good citizens, they're very participatory. But that's the fact that they are very present is causing the lawmakers to overestimate the pro-gun leanings of the entire district. And so, I think, and then gun lawmakers are afraid, right? They think they're going to lose their seats because, everybody's going to be against them. So one answer is just to be present. So do what, moms demand, students demand, March for Our Lives, these other groups that are actually trying to mobilize at the state and local level instead of just working on Congress. I think that's one answer. You're never going to win over everybody, but you have to, if you want a law like this, you have to persuade the lawmaker that it's safe to cast that vote. And, that's happened with domestic violence. The NRA is, sometimes is opposed those laws or the local gun groups, but the domestic violence people are really well organized, they're really well networked, they show up, and they've been able to get domestic violence prohibitors strengthened in states that are Republican states like Louisiana and Wisconsin. So
just to add one thing to that, part of I think what is hard is that it's not as if we have these two camps who are disagreeing on a common set of facts. Actually, there's not a common set of facts that people are looking at. So you have one side who actually believes something different, and that's why if you look at the NRA convention in the 2016, and you had everybody running in the Republican primary, going to the NRA convention and standing up and saying some version of, if you elect me, I will make sure that there are more guns in the hands of more people in more places, and so that, why? So we'll be safer, we'll protect ourselves. This idea, this belief that guns make people safer is entrenched, and people act on the basis of what they believe to be true and get guns for that reason. So that's a little discouraging, but on the other hand, we have lots of examples where cultural norms, social norms do change over time. And public health laws have a role in making that change happen. And one of the favorite examples is the controversy over whether we should have laws to mandate using seatbelts, back in the 1960s and 70s. And that was very controversial. People thought that that's an infringement on people's liberty. And the car manufacturers also objected to it. And you had these anecdotes about somebody who died because they got slung up in their seatbelt and couldn't get out of their burning car. And so seatbelts are bad. But the law was passed anyway. And now, flash forward, who wears a seatbelt because there's a law? You wear your seatbelt because it's just natural, and now the culture norms about that have changed. You couldn't enforce it. You have to click it or ticket and all that, but still, there's been a massive change in how people just do that. And I think there needs to be a change over time in our culture, a whole generational change about how we think about guns and how we think about gun safety and the need for a gun to protect ourselves. And it used to be that most people had guns for recreation and for sport and for collecting. Now the majority of people who own, particularly handguns, own them for personal protection. That's changed, it's swung, it has partly to do with these political matrices you're talking about, but it could change the other direction as well, for all these reasons we're talking about.
And I think the culture has changed. I brought the business section of the New York Times from last week. Doing nothing about the gun violence is unacceptable, and we have, 150 CEOs of companies now. Walmart's pulled their guns. This would have been unheard of a couple of years ago. So I think you're seeing that public sway, which is great.
And IRFOs are a part of this changing the culture. So traditionally, the gun violence prevention movement, the gun control movement has really focused a lot more on sort of legal change, and laws can change practices, so that's not an unreasonable thing. But most social movements are working simultaneously on legal change and social cultural change. And I would say the GVP movement, which was historically not very well resourced and sort of internally divided, was really focusing more on the legal side. The way I think about, we have something like 300, we don't even know how many guns, 300 million guns, something like that, somewhere around a third of households, probably maybe even a little bit more, maybe a little bit more, have a firearm. There's lots of guns out there. And as Jeff noted, the presumption is you are entitled to one unless there's some reason around the margins that you're not. I've thought about these laws a lot as, sort of a kind of, in some ways, a cultural response backed by a law that allows people to sort of really practice responsible gun ownership, right? So, I don't see our getting a handle on our disproportionately large gun violence problem without everyday individuals having agency. And these laws are giving, once people learn about them, giving everyday people agency. You gave a number of examples, and I think, so if I'm a spouse of somebody who has a firearm, we're living together in our home, he's acting erratically, I can be that responsible gun owner and, petition. I have a tool that I can use to petition to temporarily remove the firearm until the danger is passed. So that this is something that's, I think, in itself is also going to work on the cultural side. Now, I can't speak to, people who think Sandy Hook was a hoax. There's probably some fraction who are just not going to participate in this, but they aren't the median person.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Time for one more question if anyone has one from the audience. I've got one, then I'll close this with. It's on a related note. So when IRPO laws were first coming around and becoming popular, you saw a lot of bipartisan support for them. So the NRA came out in favor of red flag laws. President Trump, as we mentioned, came out in favor of red flag laws. Why do you think we've seen kind of a backtracking and a retrenchment to partisan divisions in these laws? And Representative Morey, why do you think it's been so hard to find bipartisan support for yours?
I think we've all mentioned it, and I think it's going to take this cultural shift, and we're overestimating the conservative positions on things. Capitalism has a lot to do with it. Who are the big donors? Where are they coming from? I mean, the NRA, look at the money they pour into politicians and the lobbyists, and we're just getting misinformation. And I think, the sway is coming from people, the cultural, societal, and it's going to change. Being patient is our only option when more and more lives are, being killed.
And I would add a political science take on this. We're a really closely divided country right now. It's a lot of, look at, how close our Congress is. I mean, there's no party that just has a kind of lock on the majority status in most state, in a lot of state legislatures or in the Congress. These can flip, right? And so as long as politicians perceive that the body can flip fairly easily, there's no incentive to actually work across the aisle and give a victory to somebody on the other side. I mean, this is like, UNC Duke basketball or something. You're not going to sort of graciously allow the other team to score a few points. I mean, it really, I'm sorry to revert to the sports metaphor, but I think it's somewhat appropriate. And so I think as a closely divided country, there's not a lot of incentive to find consensus.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar as an interloper in political science. I mean, not political science, but I mean, the thing is, to me, it's about the context of the discussion. If the discussion at the moment is about these people who died and the demand that we have to do something about it and what do we do about it, it's easier at that point to say, well, let's do this. This is something people agree on. If then, in order to enact the law, the context isn't so much about the people who died and the guns and the problem. Now the context is about politics and is about winning and losing and about the trade-offs and all that and the money from the donors. And by that time, the news cycle has passed and we're not even talking about the mass shootings anymore. There's an interesting study by computer scientists who actually quantified Twitter responses of outrage and fear and all of this after in a period around a mass shooting, and coded all this information. And they've tracked this response, this public response, as a kind of proxy from Sandy Hook to all these different mass shootings. And what they have found is that over time, the intensity of the negative reaction and the outrage has diminished. It's not as much as it used to be. And it doesn't last as long. It used to last on average like about 5 days. Now